everybody grabbing those phones. How many have never been to a night at the museum before? Raise your hand. Good deal, Richard. Yay. Got Richard. Got a lot of new faces. If you don't mind, how did you hear about it? How did y'all find out about it? Facebook? Good. Anybody else see the Facebook ads? You did? Okay, great, great. That's something kind of new that I've started doing here in the last year. And I noticed today that it went out to over 6,000 people, so I'm kind of glad 6,000 people didn't show up. But we'd have figured out something, I guess. This is our 64th night for the museum. And Phil has been at every one of them, recording them for us. So we have got a lot of great speakers on DVD. A lot of great history that we've recorded, and tonight will be no exception to that, I'm sure. Like I said, just remind y'all to please turn your phones off because he is recording that. He'll have those finished in several weeks. Those are $10. You can pick up a lot of the back copies if you've never seen some of our nights at the museum. They're all very, very good. Also tonight, our speaker will have several books that you can purchase up here. He will sign them after he's finished. So y'all be sure to pick up a book. I know they're all really, really good. We have 2 new books. If you don't have these, book 1, 2, working on book 3. John again will talk a little bit about these next month when he speaks. But we have these, are $25 a piece. If you want to get copies of these before you leave, I'll have these. Of course, John again, he's going to be our April event, so y'all don't want to miss that. If you are new here, please join our Facebook group and a page. That way you automatically get invited to our events. This year we only had 5 speakers. We didn't do February because we were unsure how the weather was going to be. And I think we made a good call on that because it's rained every day since, I don't know, what, Christmas? Yeah. So probably won't have them next February either just because of that. You might notice, or you may not, that lighting is a little better. Back here we've got a little extra lighting in the front. We're working on lighting. Phil's actually got a plug. For you that have been coming for a long time, you know that we always stretched it across the floor and I had to tape it down. Not anymore. Phil's got his own plug back there. So we've been doing some electrical upgrades. So the museum's been closed while that's going on because we have ladders and things kind of stretched out. We kind of had a big mess. We're not quite finished, so if you see that I'm closed or something on Facebook and you have a question, call me. My phone rings to me, the number rings to me 24/7. We don't have a landline, we have me. So I can get a call anywhere I'm at about the museum. So if you do have questions, be sure to call me. Don't forget, September is our big fundraiser. We have a big silent auction for you that have not been before. It's a lot of fun. We have a ton of things to bid on. And a lot of people have asked, what do you do with that money? Well, this is my hopes for this year, is to start on our new building next door. A lot of you know that we purchased the building here several years ago. It will more than double our space. I would like to see that part of it completed before I start drawing my Social Security, and that's coming up real fast. So I would like to see that happen within the next year to really start working on that building next door. It's going to be really nice. We've got lots of stories to tell, and we just don't have the space to tell them. And over there, we'll be able to tell a lot of stories. And because of that, we're going to need a lot of money. So if you would pick up an envelope, drop me a check, give me a call. We have where you can actually transfer stock, type in grass, is in charge of that. Raise your hand up for the So you can transfer stock, you can bring us your piggy bank, we don't care. But we will need a good bit of money to start that project next door. I think that's about all I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to introduce the man that's going to introduce our speaker. And that's going to be a fellow Dubakian, Ty Pendergrass. All the best people come from Dubac. Ty, if you'll come and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kelly. Certainly in for a treat tonight as we hear from Wesley Harris about outlaws and mischief makers. I knew for sure that Jack Montgomery would be here to protect what might be said about him as a mischief maker. So, but anyway, we're glad that you're all here. The reason I'm introducing our speaker, Wesley Harris, is because Wesley and I are cousins. Wesley's grandfather, John Franklin Harris, is my great-grandfather. And so they live just on the White Lightning Road out of Viana, Louisiana, about 3 miles to the west. And so Wesley and I have known each other most of our lives. Wesley, but before I say any more about Wesley, I have another special guest here. I have my sister, Ann Harris, in the back. And it's, it's March, and it's March Madness time, which is basketball. And I would venture to say, and y'all can come up afterwards to correct me, but my sister probably holds the most outstanding basketball resume of anybody in the room, being that she participated in 4 Final Fours and won 2 national championships as Lady Tech. Playing for the University of Alabama at Huntsville. So glad to have Ann here for a few days. But Wesley leads the sort of the historical efforts in Lincoln Parish. He's a lifelong resident of Lincoln Parish, and you can find out he authored several books. His primary focus has been in law enforcement, and he's currently in charge as a ranger at Lake Claiborne State Park. And when I asked Wesley how he wanted me to introduce him tonight, he said, just tell him I'm from the good side of the family. Wesley Harris.
Thank you, Ty. I appreciate the big crowd tonight. Every time I've been over here for a presentation, the room has always been full. So I'm glad to see all of y'all tonight. Ty's been over here in Minden a long time, but he's still a pretty good guy, and we still claim him as a Lincoln Parish guy. We're going to talk tonight about outlaws and mischief makers that reigned terror over North Louisiana after the Civil War. I don't have any exact figures, but I truly believe there were more people killed after the Civil War in North Louisiana than during the Civil War. There really wasn't a lot of conflict or battles in North Louisiana. You had Mansfield, Pleasant Hill, a little bit around Vicksburg. But after the war was over, there was so much chaos in the state that it seemed like every community was just ravaged by murder and robbery, and because the government was in such chaos. So we're going to talk about that period immediately after the Civil War, roughly 1866 to 1877, a period of time that's called Reconstruction, because supposedly the South was being reconstructed or rebuilt during that time. I think that's exactly the opposite of what happened. Some historians say Reconstruction never really ended in the South, particularly in Louisiana. Louisiana was the last state in the South to see federal troops withdrawn after the Civil War. After the war ended, there were still federal troops in Louisiana for 10 or 12 years. And the purpose was to support the government of what some people call carpetbaggers and scalawags against what is sometimes called home rule by Louisiana residents. I divide these outlaws and mischief makers into 4 categories. We're gonna touch on each of these categories. There were a lot of political assassinations. As I said, there was a lot of chaos in the government. At one time during the Reconstruction period, both parties claimed victory. And what happened was, in just about every office in every parish in the state of Louisiana, you had 2 office holders. In Webster Parish, you'd have 2 sheriffs, 2 judges, 2 district attorneys, because both sides claimed victory. So a lot of the violence that took place was related to the politics of the day. You also had a lot of racial violence against the newly freed slaves, and also against people who had come from the north, particularly Union Army soldiers who came to work in what was called the Freedmen's Bureau to help newly freed slaves get on their feet. They were also targeted with violence along with the freedmen themselves. And then you have what I call traditional crime, just robberies and burglaries and drunken brawls, those kinds of things that we still have today. And then the 4th category, I don't know what to call them other than just killers. They seem to thrive on killing people, not necessarily as part of a robbery or anything like that. Today you might call them serial killers because they were involved in so many murders. The first group we'll talk about is what's called the Night Riders. Have any of y'all ever heard of the Night Riders of the West Kimbrell gang? 4 or 5 people. This is probably one of the most notorious outlaw gangs in American history, but you hear very little about it. Jesse James and Cole Younger and Billy the Kid and all these people everybody's familiar with, they did nothing compared to this gang. They may have killed hundreds of people. We don't know for sure. Because their target were people after the Civil War who were moving west to Texas and to Arizona to start a new life, start over. And those people would either come down the Natchez Trace to Natchez or come cross country from Georgia and Alabama. At Natchez, they'd cross the Mississippi River on what was called the Harrisonburg Road, and they'd come across to Harrisonburg, the Winfield area, and on into Texas. And they would, this gang would hang around that road and they would ambush people as they came through with their wagon or their ox cart or whatever they were using. They would kill all the people, including the children, either drop them down in a well or bury them somewhere, take all the wagons and horses and so forth to Alexandria or somewhere and sell them. So, you know, nobody ever knew what happened to these people. You know, their families back in Alabama or South Carolina or whatever, just never heard from them again. So this happened many, many times along that road. This group was headed by a man named John West and the Kimbrell family. And they had all served in the Confederacy. They came home, and originally they kind of created a home guard where they were, because there was so much chaos in Wynn Parish, Grant Parish area, they were trying to help control the chaos and the banditry, but then they started doing it themselves. And they also murdered freed slaves. One of the crimes that really got the federal government on their trail was killing Lieutenant Simeon Butts, who was an employee of the Freedmen Bureau. He was a Union soldier that took a job with the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War. He was in charge of Jackson Parish, which at that time extended from what is now the Jonesboro area almost to the Arkansas state line. Lincoln Parish didn't exist at that time. So he covered a large area. So he had been to Natchitoches to pick up a payroll for some federal employees in his headquarters, which was Vernon, which was the parish seat of Jackson Parish at that time, and Monroe. Well, he leaves Natchitoches, crosses the Red River, and he's traveling by horseback, and he gets to Wynn Parish and encounters 3 or 4 other guys, and they say they're looking for some lost cattle. So he says he's looking for a creek or somewhere where he can get a drink of water. They say there's one right down the road here. So they take him out in the woods, and when he gets down off his horse to drink, they shoot and kill him, take the $5,000 payroll that he has, and Lieutenant Butch's body is not found for several years. This really got the Union Army, which was occupying Louisiana at the time, very upset, and there were officers within the Union Army that really went after the Kimbrell West gang at that time. But it was a long time before they actually caught up with them. This is just a newspaper article from 1870. We're talking about one of their victims was pulled out of an old well. They found his body several years after he was killed. This is St. Maurice Plantation, which doesn't exist anymore. It was on this side of the Red River, just across from Natchitoches. Lieutenant Butch had spent the night there, and he was killed right across the trail from what is now the Yankee Springs Baptist Church in Wynn Parish. These are some of the main gang members. You see John West at the top, and then there's Dan Kimbrell was an older guy, and his sons Lawson and Bill. Dan Dean was a member of the gang, but at some point he turned against them, and that's really what led to their demise. And this is some of the other gang members. But for many, many years, after the gang was taken down, there was a sign down near Atlanta, Louisiana, in Wynn Parish. It said, "This is where John West was killed." What had happened was, Dan Dean had really got run out of the area in fear of his life, but he came back and organized some of the locals who were tired of all the killing. So they got together a group of vigilantes, and they went after the outlaws and cornered them in the Masonic Lodge in Atlanta, Louisiana, and killed all of them except Lawson Kimbrell, who escaped to Texas. All of these guys here were killed. But anyway, John West, they took his head and stuck it on a fence post. And it was still there. This was in 1870. It was still there up until the 1950s. I don't know what happened to it, but at some point it disappeared, and the sign maybe disappeared. But then, like I said, this is probably the outlaw gang that killed more people than any outlaw gang you've ever heard of. But because it's Louisiana, far away from the big media markets on the East Coast, it really got no publicity over the years. So it's kind of disappeared into history. This is John West's grave marker. It's in the cemetery in Atlanta. But he's not buried there. They would not let these outlaws be buried inside the fence at the Methodist Church in Atlanta. So they're buried in a ravine outside the fence. But somebody in the family put up a marker in the cemetery at some point later on to mark his death. There's been a resurgence in interest in the West Kimbrell gang in the last few years. There's a number of books that have come out. Most of them are fictional accounts. If you're interested in the story, I can give you the titles of those books or publications that are available so you can learn a little more about this. But some people, local people in Wynn Parish who are interested in history have paid to have markers placed on some of these graves. Roe Thompson is one of the outlaws that was killed, and of course Lieutenant Butts. They were able to pinpoint where his grave is and put a marker there. They've also put markers, the large signpost historical markers you see on the highways. They put one of those down at the Wynn Grant Parish line, and they're going to put another one there where the Kimbrells live. But there's just been a lot more interest in the last few years in this particular gang and the craziness that went on at that time. I really don't know where to categorize these guys that were involved in this incident in Viana, other than they were just involved in a killing. Wasn't anything political or racial about it. But Viana, in 1872 was still part of Jackson Parish. A year later it would become Lincoln Parish, and Viana would be the parish. And I know it's hard to see anything on this map here, but the red dot in the middle is Viana. This is Arcadia here, the green dot. The yellow dot is Homer, or close to Homer, and then the blue dot over there is close to Monroe. To just give you an idea where we're looking at. But these two guys are named, one of them was named Peace, the other one was named Wadley, and they were supposedly dance instructors. They came to Viana and set up shop and were enrolling young women in their dance lessons. There were people in town who thought there may be a little bit more going on than just dancing, so these guys did not have a great reputation to begin with. Well, one day the two guys go into one of the general stores there in Viana, which was a pretty bustling town at one time. It was on the wire road going across North Louisiana. So during the Civil War, there was a lot of activity. There were plantation owners who were moving their slaves west, would go through Viana, headed to Texas, arms and ammunition and so forth. Going to the Confederacy, we're going east from Texas through Viana, headed to Vicksburg and across the Mississippi. So there was a lot going on in this little town. But these two guys walk into the general store one day and they get into an argument with the store owner. They kind of jumped into the middle of a conversation between the store owner and a drunk kid. They kind of came to the drunk kid's defense and got into an argument with the store owner, pull out a gun and shoot the store owner dead. A couple other guys come running up and they exchange some gunfire, and they wound a couple other guys, and then these two guys, Peace and Watley, take off south on their horse, which if you went south from Viana, you didn't go to Ruston because Ruston wasn't there, you went to Vernon, which was the next town to the south. They go to south to Vernon, pick up some supplies, and head to the southwest. Their goal is trying to get to Texas. So the sheriff at that particular time would have been in Vernon. So he goes to Viana first to find out what happened. So he may have crossed these guys at some point, but he gets a posse together and they take off after Peace and Watley. Well, they catch up to them almost at the Red River, trying to get to Texas. And Peace and Watley turn their horses and come charging back. If you ever seen that scene in True Grit with John Wayne, they charging at each other with shooting. Well, that's basically what happened. They shoot one of them, he falls dead. They capture the other one, they take him back to Vernon and put him in the jail. What do you think happened next? He got hung all right, but there wasn't no trial. Which is something that was very typical of that time period. I'll mention some other incidents of lynchings where prisoners were taken out of jail by a gang. It was very common then because nobody had any trust in government, because you didn't know if the Republican judge was going to try him or the Democrat judge was going to try him. You know, there was just so much confusion about who was actually in charge. that you never knew if justice was going to be done. So he's in jail in Vernon, and a gang comes in and gets the keys, takes him out, and hangs him, and that's the end of Peace and Watley. But that was a story that so traumatized that community that it was mentioned in just about every history that was written about Lincoln Parish up till World War II. Because everybody knew about it, everybody knew the guys that had been killed. And it was such a small community, everybody shopped at that store, so it had a big impact on that community that people remembered it many decades later. Who have you heard of that robbed stagecoaches? Who?
Jesse James.
Jesse James? You think Jesse James ever came to Louisiana? No? I see, yes?
I've forgotten how or what, but I remember reading about something that.
In January 1874, there was no railroad across North Louisiana. The railroad from Vicksburg to Shreveport and on into Texas had been considered, and part of it had been built from Vicksburg to Monroe, but it ended at Monroe. There was nothing from Monroe on west to Texas. So people had to rely on the wire road, and it was called the wire road because the telegraph road wires were strung alongside this road that roughly follows what is now Highway 80 or I-20. But there was a stagecoach line to cover that area where there was no train. So from Monroe to Shreveport, you had the Monroe and Shreveport stage line. And they would have a stage that would start from Monroe going west and a stage that started in Shreveport going east, and at some point they would cross during the day. Well, in January 1874, the westbound stage is stopped by a gang of 5 men near Arcadia. Somewhere between Arcadia and Minden, but closer to Arcadia. They step out in the road, they get all the passengers out. They're mainly interested in the strong box, not because strong boxes back then carried payrolls or gold or anything like that, but that's where they put the mail, and family members would mail cash back and forth to each other, so the mail is where you look for money. And they were also looking for a businessman from over around the Delhi area that they thought was going to be on that stage carrying a large amount of money. Well, that guy wasn't on the stage, but they're robbing the passengers, they're looking at pocket watches and pistols and cash and that kind of stuff. And these 5 outlaws just having a great old time. They're joking around with each other. They're complimenting the women and joking with the men. This is something that went on like 30, 40 minutes. I mean, it's not like what we think of a robbery today, where you run in, you grab the cash out of the register and take off. These guys were entertaining themselves during this robbery. Well, while they're doing that, the eastbound stage from Shreveport comes through. So they stop it and rob it too. There's only 8 double stagecoach robberies that have ever taken place. 7 of those were in Arizona, and this is the other one. But who did it? That's the question. This is the actual stage that ran from Monroe to Shreveport, one of them. It's not the greatest picture, but you see, they're kind of posing for the camera because they got the women up on the driver's seat. And that's an actual stagecoach ticket for the Monroe and Shreveport stage line from Shreveport. And you could buy a ticket to anywhere in the country, not just on that little stage line, but to continue on the train or whatever. They could sell you a ticket to whatever destination that you were going. Anybody know who that is?
Jesse James.
Jesse James. Maybe he did come to Louisiana. Okay, I know you can't see the names on the map, but the the red line at the bottom starts at Arcadia near where the 2 stagecoaches were robbed. Well, those 5 robbers were last seen headed north through Haynesville and across the Arkansas state line, headed north. Well, there was a stagecoach robbery near Hot Springs about 2 days later. 5 guys. Their MO, their method of operation was the same as the Arcadia robbery. You know, they kidded around with the passengers. They even gave one guy $5 back so he could get to his destination. They took all the $5. Well, a short time later, there's a train robbed up near the Arkansas-Missouri border. Same thing, 5 guys. They behaved the same way in their interactions with the passengers on the train. Who lived in Missouri? The Jameses and the Youngers. Some of them fit the description of Frank and Jesse James and Cole Younger and one of his brothers, and then there was a 5th guy. When Jesse James was killed sometime later at his home in Missouri, they recovered a watch that was taken from the Hot Springs stagecoach robbery. So if you believe the same people committed all these robberies, if he committed the Hot Springs robbery, what's the odds are he committed the 2 stagecoach robberies in Louisiana? I think it's pretty good. You know, tons of books have been written about the Jameses and Youngers, and nobody has ever pursued that investigation. And so I tried to use 40 years in law enforcement to try to piece together what you would call probable cause that they were more than likely involved in the Louisiana bank robberies. And the fact that there's 3 robberies headed back to their hometown is only one piece of evidence. After the Civil War, or during the Civil War, the Jameses and the Youngers fought in military units in northeast Louisiana, around Delhi, and Tallulah, and Vicksburg, and Lake Providence, up in that area. So they were familiar with the area. Cole Younger's sister lived in Delhi, where coincidentally, this businessman that they were targeting was from. So what I believe happened is they got wind this guy was fixing to be traveling. He was supposed to have a lot of money, so they ride on ahead so that they can rob the stagecoach when he comes in. But he had some kind of delay and ended up taking the stagecoach the next day. So these are the 5 guys that are believed to have committed all of those robberies. Jesse and Frank James, Cole and his brother Bob, and Arthur McCoy. This is Jesse, this is Frank. The one at on the right over there is Cole Younger. And I think the one on the left is Bob. I don't have a picture of him, McCoy. But if you read every book that's ever been written about Jesse James and Cole Younger and their gang, you won't find any mention of Louisiana, except for the book that Cole Younger wrote after he was captured in a botched robbery in Minnesota. The only crime that he ever admitted to, but he writes in his book that he lived in the Lake Providence, Floyd, Delhi area after the Civil War. He uses people in that area of Louisiana as alibis for robberies they were accused of all over the country. So I really believe they spent considerable time in northeast Louisiana between robberies and kind of using it as a safe haven. Because other than the stagecoach robberies, there's no evidence that they ever committed any kind of crime in Louisiana. They basically used it as a place where they could lay low. And after the Arcadia stagecoach robberies, they never returned to Louisiana. So I think it's a pretty good bet that they are the robbers for those stagecoaches. Who's heard of this guy?
Lake Road.
He's a fine minute guy, isn't he?
He was in the Homer case.
Lincoln Wagner was born in 1865, the last year of the Civil War, in what was then Claiborne Parish, but is now actually part of Webster Parish. To be named Abraham Lincoln Wagner at the end of the Civil War in North Louisiana, that's something a little unique. His father was a strong Unionist. He did not support the Confederate cause, so he named him Lincoln. And you ever heard that song, A Boy Named Sue? His daddy wanted to make him tough. Well, I think he overachieved in naming him Lincoln Wagner. He committed so many crimes. I tried to outline some of it here because it's so hard to keep up with. I mean, this guy was a one-man wrecking machine. He fits in that category of just an outright killer, because he's not killing in the commission of robberies or political assassinations. He just encounters somebody that pisses him off, and you know the guy's dead. So one of the first things that he's involved in is the murder of a guy named Tud Grider. Grider and Link's brother had got into some kind of argument or dispute, and Grider had killed Link's brother. Well, the grand jury decided that it was self-defense, and they released him. Well, that did not satisfy the Wagner family, so they went after Grider and ended up killing him. Well, Link and his brother Spank were seen at the scene. There was a trial, and Link was acquitted, but Spank was convicted of murder and sent to the Louisiana State Penitentiary. So he got off on that one. Well, just a short time later, Link and this guy named Munn Newsom got into some kind of argument. In a bar, they were both drinking, and Link tries to shoot him. Ends up shooting Newsom's horse instead. But he's charged with attempted murder. So they have another trial. Again, he's found not guilty. I don't know whether he's got some political pull or what's going on here, but again, he tries to kill Newsom a second time. And badly wounds Newsom this time, flees to Arkansas with his brother Spank, who has broken out of the Louisiana Penitentiary. So they are hiding in Arkansas, and this is in 1891, and the Claiborne Parish deputy goes to Arkansas, where he's been captured, and brings him back. But in the meanwhile, the main witness in that case on the Newsom killing has been killed as well. So he's brought back. Well, the people in Homer have decided they have had enough. They are going to do the same thing that the Viana and Vernon residents did with Peace and Watley. They're going to break into the jail and break him out and hang him. What they don't know is that some friends of Wagner have gotten word that this is going to take place, and they have smuggled 2 revolvers into the jail to Wagner. So when they knock a hole through the brick wall of the Homer jail, and they're met by gunfire, and several of the vigilantes are wounded, and Wagner is left alone. They can't get to it. Well, the sheriff in Claiborne Parish decides, this is just not secure enough, so they move him to the jail in Monroe. Eventually, they bring him back to Homer, they have another trial, and he's found not guilty again. So this is 3 trials where he's involved in a murder or an attempted murder, and he's gotten off. During all this time, his name also comes up with murders in Arkansas, Louisiana, and East Texas. So people are really not very happy that this guy is hanging around their community. One of the guys that was involved in that mob that tried to get into the Homer jail was a guy named Tom Kinder, who was also a killer. He, the story is that he was a lawman at one time, but I haven't been able to verify that, but he was involved in a number of killings, particularly Claiborne, Webster Parish area. Well, at some point in time, he is arrested and put in the adjoining cell with Link Wagner. And he asked the sheriff just to give them both some Winchesters, and they'll just have it out right there and save the parish a trial. That didn't happen, but that tells you what kind of guy that he was. Anyway, after he shot Holland, he fled to Texas, and the Webster Parish Sheriff went to Texas with a posse, and they were able to capture him and bring him back and put him in the jail here in Minden. Well, again, a mob of men tried to get into the jail to get to him, and I'm just going to read you part of the newspaper article that told the story. They hear a commotion at the jail, and what the newspaper article says is, when citizens started out of the houses toward the jail, they were met by armed sentries and forcibly driven back. On all sides, the jail was guarded by armed men who had taken possession of every avenue that led to it. One man avoided the sentries and went to the Presbyterian church and rang the bell to arouse the citizens. He also fired his pistol several times. The deputy sheriff lived a mile away and heard nothing of it. Before the sheriff could be appraised of what was going on, the mob had accomplished its horrible and most cowardly work. A Times representative, this is in the Shreveport Times, who went to Minden yesterday, interviewed the 3 men who were in the cell with Wagner and learned from their own lips the story of the most brutal assassination it had ever been his misfortune to record. After the mob had cut its way through the brick wall of the jail, 6 or 7 masked men came through the aperture, all heavily armed, and made their way upstairs to the upper tier of cells. The attackers were led by a man who appeared to be perfectly familiar with the interior of the jail. In this cell, as in the others, there was a triangular ventilation flue in one corner, which was constructed by riveting a heavy piece of iron across the closed corner of the cage. So imagine you have a corner of the jail, and you got a metal plate to kind of create a flue to create some ventilation. Wagner had squeezed himself up that flue, so only his feet were hanging visible. So the mob comes to the cell, and they want to know where he's at. They've got a lantern, and they're looking in there trying to identify him. And the other prisoners say, he's not here. But apparently, they knew he was in there, and they threatened to shoot the other prisoners if they didn't give him up. So they say, he's up that thing. So the mob with their lanterns tell the prisoners, you got to bring him to us. You got to pull him down out of that chimney and bring him over here to the door. So this is what the reporter says. The men who had lanterns flashed a light into the cell and asked for Lincoln. The prisoner said he was not there. They swore that he was in there and threatened to shoot or dynamite all of them if they didn't produce him. Frightened to death, the prisoners gave away his hiding place. The prisoners were ordered, under pain of death if they refused, to drag Link down out of the flue. This they proceeded to do, grasping him by the feet and by main strength pulling him until his finger holds gave way. When they had him partially out, one man shot at Wagner's leg and missed him. Wagner exclaimed, "Lord, have mercy on my people. Gentlemen, let me talk." And one man said, "Yes, as long as you don't name any of us to the people outside." The other prisoners were ordered to stretch out and hold Link close to the open bars of the cell within a few inches of the muzzles of their pistols, so that the two lynchers who had been delegated to shoot him would have a clear shot. Wagner, helpless in the hands of two powerful men, one of whom had both hands in his powerful grasp and Link's head securely under his left arm and the other man holding his feet off the floor, commenced to curse his executioners and told them if they would give him a pistol and a man's chance, he would whip the whole bunch. So they're holding him up against the bars of the jail cell like this, and they shoot him 12 times from outside the cell and kill him. So his reign of terror on North Louisiana has ended, and the people of Minden was able to do something the people of Homer could not do. And that was take this guy out of commission. I got a newspaper article here, and I know you can't read it, but this guy was so notorious, he appeared in newspapers all over the country. I mean, he was very well known at that time. Anybody ever heard of the Coshada Massacre? Coshada is in Red River Parish, and during the Civil War, Red River Parish didn't exist. What happened during the period of Reconstruction is the party in control, which was called the Radical Republicans, created other parishes so that they could have more power in the legislature. You know, so a carpetbagger would come in and he would basically take control of an area and get his political cronies in the legislature to create a new parish. That's the reason we have Grant Parish, Red River Parish, Lincoln Parish, and several others that were created during the Reconstruction period by the Radical Republicans to give them more control and to give them a power base in that particular community. This guy, Marshal Twitchell, was the perfect example of a carpetbagger. And they called them carpetbaggers because they supposedly came south with all their stuff in a bag or suitcase that was made out of a fabric that really looked like carpet. He came from Vermont. He also was an employee of the Freedmen's Bureau, just like Lieutenant Butts. He was assigned to Bienville Parish. Well, he married a local belle from a prominent Bienville Parish family that had a lot of money. I think she brought some money with her because he moved to what became Red River Parish and bought a plantation. And his son, who was in the state legislature, got a bill introduced and passed to create a new parish out of parts of the adjoining parishes to create Red River. So Twitchell was elected as the state senator from Red River Parish. So his son is the state rep, he's the state senator. He brings a number of his brother-in-laws from Vermont down, and they become the sheriff and the judge and the parish treasurer. So they have pretty much complete control over this parish. Well, the local white Democrats did not like this too much, as you can imagine. And in 1874, they take 6 white office holders from Red River Parish out of the the area, tell them, if you'll go to Texas and don't come back, we'll let you live. So they ride them to the state line where there's this other gang waiting, supposedly somebody that this mob doesn't know. And they kill those 6 office holders, which included all of Twitchell's brother-in-laws and some other men. So at this time, Twitchell is in New Orleans, which was the state capital at the time, trying to get federal troops to come to Red River to protect the Republican office holders and the freedmen. Obviously, they were too late to help out most of the family, but 2 years later, Twitchell is still in Red River Parish, and as he's rowing across the Red River from his plantation to Coshada on the other side of the river, someone tried to assassinate him. He has both his arms shot off, and you can see in this picture, he's got 2 wooden arms. His wife dies of yellow fever. Most of the wife's sisters also die of yellow fever. So he leaves his plantation, leaves Louisiana, and goes back. But while that's one of the more deadly incidents involving political assassinations, it's by no means the only one. There very similar things happen in many parishes in Louisiana. It didn't always resort to bloodshed, but there were quite a number of carpetbaggers and scalawags. Anybody know what a scalawag is? That was a local person who basically took the radical Republican side. They may have supported the Union during the Civil War, but they were despised more so than the carpetbaggers because they were locals and they were supposed to know better. But he left, and that's just very typical of some of the political assassinations that took place. There were quite a number of law enforcement officers who were killed, particularly if they were on the Republican side. The sheriff of Washington Parish was assassinated after he tried to investigate some election irregularities where freedmen weren't allowed to vote. There were political assassinations like in Caldwell Parish, where the judge and the district attorney were both killed. The judge was a Republican and the district attorney was a Democrat, but he was a witness, so he had to be taken out when they took out the Republican judge. This is about the last one I'll do. This good-looking guy here was an actor. His name was Maurice Barrymore. Y'all heard of the Barrymore family? He is the father of John Lionel and Ethel Barrymore, who made tons of movies in the 30s and 40s. And, he is the great-grandfather of Drew Barrymore, the actress. The ugly-looking guy on the right is Big Jim Curry. He was another brutal killer, and his brother was the mayor of Shreveport. Well, Curry made his living as what was called a railroad detective, but really all that means is he was a bouncer for the railroad. If you were trying to hop on a freight car or something like that, you know, he would jerk you off and beat you to a pulp and leave you laying by the tracks. There really wasn't a lot of detecting to it. He was a very brutal guy. That's how he made his living. And every time he got into trouble, his brother, the Shreveport mayor, would send lawyers to get him out of trouble. Well, the Barrymore and a number of other actors were traveling the country, putting on plays, and they ended up in Marshall, Texas. Well, they performed their play to a huge house. It used to be a huge opera house in Marshall, just like many communities in the South. Afterwards, they went to the train station where there was a lunchroom slash bar and ordered some food. Well, Jim Curry started paying too much attention to one of the actresses in that troupe. And one of the actors intervened and said, you know, you need to leave the lady alone. Well, his response was to pull out his pistol and start shooting everybody in there. He shoots Maurice Barrymore and seriously injures him, and they move him to the hotel, and it took him a couple of months to recover. One of the other actors is killed. Eventually, Barrymore goes back to New York City, and the law arrested Curry, put him in jail, but then their witnesses started disappearing. So they had to track down witnesses. So it was over a year before they were able to take Big Jim Curry to trial. This is one of maybe a dozen men that he had killed, mostly across Texas and Oklahoma. They have the trial, and they managed to get their witnesses back in and present a pretty good case. But in 10 minutes' time, the jury comes back with a not guilty by reason of insanity. And they've said because he was intoxicated, he didn't know what he was doing. Well, in Louisiana law now, intoxication is not a defense unless it is induced by somebody else. Someone pours it down your throat. But just because you're drunk does not exempt you from criminal responsibility. Well, it comes to find out that he had 3 or 4 lawyers, all from Shreveport, paid for by his Shreveport mayor brother, and the jury had been paid off. So some things never change, do they? I've got a few of my books up here. This book is an account of the prisoner of war camp that was near Ruston during World War II. It focuses on a German submarine crew that was captured off the coast of Africa and put in that POW camp in Ruston of all places. Because it was so far from the coast, so far from major media, that kind of stuff, they were trying to hide the fact that they had captured this submarine because they got the Enigma code machine and code books, and they didn't want Germany to know that those things had been captured because they would change the codes. So this talks a little bit about the POW camp and some of the submariners in particular.
How much is that one?
This is $10.
Okay.
This is one I'm really proud of. I worked on this for about 15 years, mainly because it's just so difficult to find enough facts to put together a book. This is a story of a Deputy United States Marshal for the Western District of Louisiana, which would have been everything west of the Mississippi. His boss was in Shreveport, but he lived right at what is now the Lincoln Parish line around Clay. He ends up moving to Ruston, where he's also hired as the Ruston police chief. Ruston hadn't been around long at that time, and like a lot of the cities that popped up on the railroad when it was finally completed across North Louisiana, when you have the train come in, then you start having undesirables come in that want to get drunk and party and shoot up the town and that kind of stuff. You've seen Wild West movies where the rowdy guys come to town and cause problems. He was hired as the police chief, also while serving as a U.S. Marshal to clean up the town. So this is written like a novel. If you look in the back, there's all kinds of notes to document the sources. So this is as factual as I could get it, and while it's still written as a novel. And if you have any Ruston connections, this is a history of Ruston in postcards, of 100 postcards in here, basically telling Ruston's history.
How much is that one?
This is 14, this is 1895. Any questions I can answer for y'all?
Did you, this is not for this, but did you know, have you ever heard of or researched the Pat Garrett's parents that are buried over in Homer in the
Yes,
old Homer
I have.
cemetery?
Yeah, Pat Garrett spent some time as a child in the Homer area, really closer to, I guess, between Homer and Summerfield. His family's had a farm out there, so his youth was spent there. When he got to about 18, he moved west on his own. And of course, he's the guy that eventually shot Billy the Kid. And, you know, and the parents are buried in the old Homer cemetery near downtown. Anybody else?
Do you know anything about, did somebody else raise their hand?
No. Sorry.
In the 50s, when I was a teenager, and we lived between Homer and Haynesville. It was the old Malone place, and going from Homer, it was about 4 miles or so out on the left. But anyway, my oldest brother was out in the field plowing potatoes, or either getting it ready to plant potato seed, and he came across, he found it's a Virginia Military Institute it could either be a belt buckle or something off of a pouch or something, I'm not sure. But anyway, and then I know, you said something about the armies had been up in northwest Louisiana or in Louisiana and different places.
You know,
And I was just wondering if that was possible, could be a Civil War thing.
that's very possible. You know, there were many troops that crossed back and forth across Louisiana. And of course, when the Union Army tried to come up the Red River to capture Freeport, which was the capital at that point in time, and then they wanted to move on into Texas to capture the manufacturing plants that were creating gunpowder and ammunition and so forth. Of course, that was a failure, but there were Confederate troops who came down through Arkansas to help cut them off if they got near Freeport. You know, so there were a lot of camps across North Louisiana. Most of them were very temporary because those military units for the Confederacy in North Louisiana were constantly on the move. I mean,
Yeah, I knew that, I had heard that they, different, but I just wasn't sure if that would be something that would be found later or something. But anyway, I've had it for years, so I still got it.
yeah, that's very possible. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I had been told that I had a great-grandfather that left Homer because there was a feud between the Wagoners and the Tuggles. Could that have been the Wagoners that was there?
Yeah, that's the Ramsey Tuggle feud. I just talked to Mr. Tuggle earlier tonight. We want to get with him and try to learn more about that. I had studied that some. That was in the 1890s, so it's a little bit further into the future from the Civil War than what I talked about. But we've all heard about the Hatfields and McCoys and that feud in Tennessee. You know how many people were killed in the Hatfield and McCoy feud? 6. You know how many were killed in the Tugsy-Ramsey feud? 21. So, you know, again, the notoriety of some of these outlaws and these gangs is more related to how close they were to a media market, a major newspaper, or somebody picked up on them and started writing about them. You know, Jesse James and Cole Younger became famous because there was a Kansas City newspaper editor that befriended them, and they communicated back and forth a good bit, and you know, he wrote these Robin Hood type stories about them. There was nobody to write about the Ramseys and Tuggles. You know, very small newspapers in North Louisiana, what few there were, You know, wasn't on a major river or a rail line where those stories would be disseminated all over the country. So, you know, it kind of faded into history. But, you know, as far as the number of victims, it's obviously a much more serious event than the Hatfield McCoy.
I'm sorry, but I just wanted to, I was gonna tell you something about the Tuggle thing. If you'll talk to Alan Rock Tuggle in Homer, he can tell you all about it. Do you know Rock?
I do not know him. I've tried to talk to some people in the Homer area, and a lot of them don't want to talk about it.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Well, the reason I know about it was my husband and Rock were real close, and Rock told him a lot of different things. Now, Mr. Kit back here somewhere, he knows about it too.
When they had the big shooting going on out there, a music teacher was shot and killed on Courthouse Square between two of the factions, and he was killed accidentally. I think his name was William. He was up close to the hardware store and all that, close to the courthouse. And Mr. Tuggle and his family went down below Natchitoches. There's a steel workers plantation down there, and it was privately owned. It was private. The state had something to do with it for a while. Now it's privately owned, and I went down there to see about it. Couldn't go see about it, but they spent the whole cotton crop down there, living in the attic of this thing, and that's on record from Louisiana Tech, and it's the book is called Reconstruction on the Red, and that book was printed 15 or 20 years ago, and I never did buy it. But anyway, at one instances, Mr. Tuggle and them went down to Natchitoches, went someplace around there close to Natchitoches in Alexandria, and were on the way back to the plantation. So they had to go to Alexandria because the other places aren't further. But anyway, they went down there and did something, and we're coming back in a wagon, and one of the Tuggles has said, somebody's following us. They don't come up close like they're going to pass us. So Mr. Tuggle stepped out of the wagon with his rifle and stepped in the edge of the woods. And when the wagon come around, they all got blindsided each other, and seeing there was only less people in the wagon, they turned around and went the other way.
Tom Kinder that I mentioned, who was enemies with Link Wagner, was involved in the Tuggle-Ramsey feud, and
he killed my great-grandfather, his last Tuggle of the Tuggle and Ramsey. He killed my great-grandfather.
Kinder committed several of the murders in that.
And he killed my great-grandfather in Cotton Valley in a cotton field in front of the field. Grandpa died a day later from a shot in the head.
I'll be around after the meeting if you have any more questions. Thank you very much. I'll be back in May to talk about the history of Highway 80 and how it helped North Louisiana become what it is today. Thank you very much.
Right now. Come on up, and Wesley, if you'll stand up there by your books and make sure.